We are closing out our theme of safety with a very relevant topic, homelessness. Over 2 years of pandemic life, inflation, and volatile housing markets have exacerbated the problem of being unhomed for many people. There are a lot of misconceptions and narratives that surround homelessness, and it's often difficult to navigate truth and separate that from perception.
That's very true, Holland. So as we talk about safety and poverty and the unhomed, the messaging and words that we use, and we really appreciate words here on the Afterword, but these words matter. So how do we talk about a situation like poverty and homelessness while keeping the underlying focus of humanity central? In an article by Bill Pitkin and Nat Kendall Taylor, they share it's easy to give in to the urge to argue and push back on incorrect understandings by repeating them and showing people how wrong they are. An example is the misperception that everyone living without housing is violent or suffering from addiction and mental health issues. So to help us with this concept, with this idea, to make sure that our words matter in a way that is productive, we are really going to take a careful dive into this episode on poverty and homelessness and safety. And we are so thankful to have Susan McLarty here with us from the Greenville Homeless Alliance. So welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Joining us as well is Brett Rawl with Upstate Continuum of Care and Lorain Crowl from United Housing Connections. We're thrilled both of you could join us.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Holland Webb.
Hi, I'm Amy Boland.
And you're listening to The Afterword, a conversation about the future of words.
I know all of you have personal stories and something that led you into the work that you do. In just 60 seconds each, would you mind sharing the Cliff Notes version of your life and who you are? And we'll start with you, Susan, and get through Brett and wind up with Lorain.
Sure. Thank you. Well, I grew up mostly in Eastern Tennessee, and to this day, I continue just to love being outdoors, and especially if I'm in the mountains. And I moved to this area after graduating from North Carolina State University to actually work in automotive textile design for Milliken. I switched careers to work in mission outreach and congregational care for Westminster Presbyterian in Greenville. And around this time, my husband and I found that we were hoping that one of us could travel a little bit less. So that was helpful because the new job allowed me to stay here in Greenville and not be traveling across the upstate as well as the whole country and internationally. So fast forward to 2016, I caught this bug that led me to the work of homelessness and housing by realizing that even with all the good work happening within Westminster Presbyterian, the city of Greenville was now facing a housing crisis, and especially for people with low or extremely low incomes. So I became involved, and in 2018, I was hired to be the first coordinator of the Greenville Homeless Alliance.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Brett, what about you? What's your story?
So I grew up on a dairy farm in Lexington, South Carolina, and I went to college at Winthrop University in Rock Hill for a Bachelor of Social Work. And during that, I had to do an internship. I actually got an internship working with the COC in Columbia. So I was working under their homeless management system information administrator, kind of doing the same work. And after I graduated, I got a call from the Upstate that said that they were looking for someone to come do intakes and work with their coordinated entry system. And so I kind of had that background and moved up to Greenville and really got involved with the COC and kind of revamping their coordinated entry system to make sure that we can house the most vulnerable people in our community and give them situations where they can really thrive.
All right. Thank you. Lorain?
Yeah, so I would call myself a native of Greenville. I was actually born in Kingsport, Tennessee, but my dad moved us down here as he was a certified electrician. So he moved us down here to actually wire the first big skyscraper in Greenville, which was called the Daniel Building. It's about 10 stories. And so I've been here ever since. But as an adult, I have two boys, but as an adult, my sister became very ill with liver cancer, and she passed. And so, at that point in my life, sometimes you have those paradigm shifts and you go, okay, I'm going to look at life a little differently. And so I decided I wasn't going to do anything that really didn't matter anymore. And so I started with writing some legislation with the South Carolina legislature for a organ and tissue donor registry because, of course, my sister's situation, and then sort of worked myself out of a job. And ever since then, I've been working with nonprofits and building their annual funds and their systems and their culture and all kinds of things, and then landed in this job, which I'm not quite sure I'm going to be able to work myself out of, but working to house and support folks who are low income and experiencing homelessness or at risk for homelessness.
All right. Thank you. Well, now we know everybody, and we're going to learn everything in the next hour.
Well, we are so excited that you all are here. I do have a question, Brett, because I am notorious for not understanding acronyms. What is COC?
I will say we have an entire dictionary of nothing but acronyms and have had entire conversations in only acronyms. So I will probably do that a lot. Definitely call me out on it.
I will.
The COC is the Continuum of Care. So It's one of the HUD mandated programs. And I know Lorain can talk about some of this also, but we're kind of the collaborative applicant for our 13 county region. So all of the HUD funds that come into our community for homeless services, we're kind of the spearhead for that.
Okay, wonderful. Because again, our audience, our listeners is varied, and we want to support those who are so passionate about learning about this topic. And so in order to do that, we are going to do a little definition round, because what we've found is that sometimes we use words, as we talked about in our opening, in ways that we think we understand what they mean, but we understand that words matter. So lightning round, whoever wants to take this, feel free to jump in. We're going to just kind of define some terms. The first one is affordable housing. We kind of talked about this on an earlier episode, but from your perspective, what does this mean?
I would say housing that every single person that lives and breathes can afford.
Yeah, and I'd say it's a math equation. So a lot of times you'll hear it's reasonable to pay 30% or less of your household income for your housing. So we often encourage people to get out your calculator, look at your household income, do the math. And if it's 30% or less, which my family is in that 30% or less, I'm like, great, I live in affordable housing.
Right. Okay. I don't know why that doesn't make me feel good, but 30% seems like a lot for housing sometimes.
And I would say too, that it is relative. It depends on what I spend my 30% or the rest of my 70% on, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So
Yeah. Really good point. Okay. This one is a term that was brand new to me. Encampment sweep.
Further extending and demoralizing people without a home.
Okay.
Yes.
What is it though? What happens?
It is literally taking everything someone owns without their permission and moving it or destroying it and leaving them with nothing.
Where are they typically doing these encampment sweeps?
Most of the time in the county, we experience that here. Now, I'm not saying every community has that issue. I'm sure there are cities that have encampments, but we see a real split between those who are in the county, and most of those folks live in encampment situations. In the city, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit different equation. There's a lot of street homelessness in the city. People literally sleeping on the streets. So,
and I would just add that sometimes it is enforced because it may be on private property.
Okay, so it's not necessarily public property. That's a good differentiation. That helps.
I think you see a lot of it with the more gentrification that is happening around the country. I know a lot of these encampments, the ones that are are within the county might be in spaces where new developers coming to put up some big skyscraper apartment complex that they're going to charge $3,000-$4,000 a month for. And these people have been living there and making that their home for the past how many ever years. But someone's come in with money and is able to push those out who really don't have anything but the tents that they're sleeping in.
Okay. Really good perspectives. Appreciate that. That really helps. Homeless versus unhomed.
Unhomed is not a term that I've ever really used. And even homeless anymore is not something that we use. At the COC, we try to make a big push to use person first language. So not saying a homeless person, but a person experiencing homelessness. So homelessness is not the defining factor of their life, kind of recognizing first and foremost that they are a person and they are just happening to live in this situation of homelessness.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would say I've heard some of the Brett's age and younger start to use the unhoused word because I think we also try to always lead with the person-centered language first, but just the less part of homeless can also imply that you're less than or sort of be derogatory in the very nature. But I will say this has evolved just in the evolution of the idea of forming the Homeless Alliance, because through HUD and sort of best practices across the country, that person-centered language really became more emphasized, I would say, around 2016. And the idea of the Homeless Alliance kind of bubbled up in 2015. So we've been working. There's still a lot of people that have been in this work a long time that have a harder time changing their language, I would say.
I would say, too, that sheltered and homeless and unhomed, when you say homeless, it almost is one of those things where you can say, well, that could never happen to me. But the word unhoused or unhomed is something that makes you perk up and say, oh, man, I can relate to that word. And so same with experiencing homelessness rather than just abstractly saying folks are homeless.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate this person first language because some of the terms seem like it objectifies it a bit.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Sheltered, emergency sheltered, unsheltered homelessness. I know there's 3 terms in there, but I think there's a lot to unpack. So what does it mean to be sheltered?
So sheltered could be a number of things. Having a roof over your head. So whether that is an agency paying for a hotel room, or you are living in a building that might have utilities, but it's not necessarily your normal residence. So really having that roof over your head, an emergency sheltered can fall into that. For our definition of things, we have at the continuum of care, we have to follow HUD's language on this. So we have to look at literally homeless, so literally not having any resources, any residence. If you're living with your friends or family, you're not necessarily considered homeless. You're more sheltered than anything because you do have that roof and you have those resources to help. And emergency shelter can fall within that, definitely.
Okay, that makes sense. Anything else to add?
Well, I would say the unsheltered homeless is exactly what it sounds like. It's literally not having a place to that's fit for human habitation, that has any sort of even if it's a roof, it has no hot water, no heat, no amenities, nothing that would actually constitute a safe environment.
Okay, would that be part of the tent encampment situation?
Certainly.
Okay. Wow, this is so helpful, again, for people who aren't in this world every day, just to break it down just a bit. Thank you so much. And the last one, permanent supportive housing.
So many people get confused about permanent supportive housing. Many think it is providing permanent housing, only just, across the board with support services. The way HUD defines permanent supportive housing, and it is a HUD related term, is that it is housing folks, providing housing and support services for those folks with disability. And so that is the way permanent supportive housing is defined in our world, at least.
Okay. So there has to be a diagnosed disability or something that would prevent them from getting other type of services?
Well, it's a little bit loose because, some people who are in a situation who've never been to a doctor, if we had to get a letter from a doctor, we'd never get one.
That's what I was asking. Yeah.
Right. And so what we rely on are our support services providers, typically our outreach teams, and people who go out are mental health professionals or other professionals that in the field, case managers, social workers, who can attest to some form of disability. We do require it written, but our folks face so many barriers that literally having that happen, we may not get them housed. And so while we do have some documentation, it is from a professional, but maybe not necessarily a hospital or a doctor's office.
Okay. Wow, this is so helpful. I feel like now when we ask these questions, and again, somebody just shout out, what does HUD stand for? I knew everybody should know this, but just in case.
It's the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development.
Okay, perfect. Wonderful. Thank you all so much.
Yes, thank you. All right, so we have behind us some definitions and some common language. Let's start looking at the research. A report by the group Invisible People was released in 2020, and it uncovered many of the opinions and attitudes that the public holds regarding the causes of homelessness. 73% of the people surveyed believed that homelessness has increased in their communities. And yet there was a very varied response to how or even if communities should engage with people who are without housing. So what are some of the messages you would want the public to hear?
I'm happy to jump in and just say that definitely become harder to what we say exit that experience of being homeless or not having a house. And some of this is related to the growth we've seen happen in Greenville. And so one thing that we track and try to help the public understand is our incomes have not been rising at the same rate as our housing cost. And especially if you're on a fixed income or, you're working in a field where your income may be limited by something, like our minimum wage has not raised during this time either. So for example, I mentioned in 2015, the idea of the Homeless Alliance bubbled up. What we refer to from the HUD guidelines for income for a family of four was at $58,000 in 2015. But just this year, it's come out and it's risen to $85,200 still for a family of four. So you think about, have our incomes kept pace with that? So that's just one contributing factor that really impacts those who earn the least the most.
And I would say one thing that would be surprising for folks to know about our coordinated entry system, the folks who are residing, many of the folks, I would say at least 40% of the folks that reside in that system, and we have over 400 households in that system. Many live in hotels. They live on fixed incomes. They're elderly or disabled, and they live on fixed incomes. They'll live in hotels for 2 weeks, then run out of money, and then they're back living in their car again. And, I think people would be surprised to know the number of people that we have that are in that situation that are not addicted to substance abuse or have severe mental illness, but have a situation where a fixed income is keeping them, as Susan said, with the cost of living and housing, it's keeping them from being housed.
One thing that I know that especially since I've started working in this field, that we try to emphasize to everybody, because most people think that they would never end up in a situation like this. But most people are one check away from being in a homeless situation. So think about where you're at. You might not be living paycheck to paycheck, but if you were without income for a month, think about, the cost of your housing, your utilities, your insurance, your food. If you have kids, you have all of those extra things that you've got to pay for a month. And all of that is very expensive. And so anyone could really end up in this situation for no fault of their own.
Yeah, if I could, I'll share one recent story that may help people think about this a little differently. But we were contacted by Trying Mercy Center because they were working with someone attending their church who'd been paying rent for 7 years on time, enjoying where he lived. And suddenly one day he found out he had 30 days and the entire apartment complex had been purchased and would be renovated. And they said, oh, well, we're happy to suggest somewhere for you to move. However, the rent he was paying was affordable. He kept been on time for 7 years. What they offered him was actually more than his entire monthly income. So he came to Triune and said, where can I go? I have this ticking clock now. And, they reached out to us to try to see if there were any other resources we knew of available. But with everyone putting all hands on deck, they were not able to find anywhere for him to move that was affordable to his income. And once the apartments are renovated, he knows that they'll come back still at a higher cost per month than his income.
Wow. Okay. So that just kind of leaves us hanging because this person has no solution at this point to their housing situation. So, Susan, you've really stepped right into this next question. You've walked us through some of these factors that contribute to homelessness. But as the experts, and boy, you all are definitely the experts in your fields. What are some of the challenges to that role? So, I'm going to go back to you, Susan. You've got this situation, all hands on deck, everyone's trying, and you still can't find a solution. What are some of the challenges to that situation? How do you deal with that?
Well, he's staying in touch with the social workers at Triune, and they're continuing, to work and look for housing. But he became what Lorain referred to as literally homeless, nowhere to go, but does have, income, and I think that's just an example of he doesn't have family who could take him in. That was something that Brett touched on. So sometimes we say catastrophic loss of family for whatever reason. He's an older gentleman who's on a fixed income. Just doesn't have anyone to help him in the situation, but Triune will continue to walk alongside him and do everything that they can to help him find housing ultimately.
Okay. How about you, Lorain and Brett? What are some of the challenges that you've seen in your roles?
Well, like Susan, we are charged with putting about $12 million out in the community over 5 years of American Rescue dollars. And what we're seeing is that, while we are able to help people for a few months, they are literally priced out, and we are paying rent 30%, 40% more than they can afford. And so honestly, what we're doing is just kicking the can down the road, hoping that in some way they'll be able to engage some affordable housing, apartment complex that they can get, that they'll be able to get a unit. It is just literally not happening. And we have been in housing crisis now, as Susan said, since 2014 in affordable housing. And, we're now saying it is beyond crisis. What is the next word we can use that will wake people up to say, we are losing our housing for our lowest income families? We're literally losing all of our marginalized and minority populations in our community because they have nowhere to live.
Wow. Okay. That's a challenge. What about you, Brett?
I'll agree. And I've kind of been in a couple of different roles since starting here. So I started doing intakes with people in our 13 counties who were experiencing homelessness. And a big issue that we used to face, and still face now, is kind of funding and the stipulations that come with funding. So each funder has their own definition of who can be served or how long they can be served. So that's kind of one area of the issue. We don't really have any sort of a funding source that can cover anybody and everybody. I mean, there's some that it can only be youth, some it can only be those who have a serious and persistent mental illness. So that's one major issue. Another one, we don't have enough funding. So where we have, funding for youth, so those who are between 18 and 25, we don't have nearly enough of it to address everybody. One person that we work with, Bruce Forbes, he says that we have, this much funding and this many people. So we try to do our best to kind of spread it as best we can. But an issue that we've seen definitely since the pandemic is finding housing. I work closely with our coordinated entry system now in a different role than I did to begin with. Referring people is not an issue. Agencies will have funding, but finding a place for them to go, even finding a house that may be a little bit outside of their budget, but just finding somewhere to put them is next to impossible.
Wow. Thank you all so much. I know this is heavy, but we really appreciate you sharing these challenges. It's important for us to hear them. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to know how policies differ between the state level and the federal level, and maybe some of the avenues that your organizations have taken that have been successful in supporting people who are without housing.
Well, one thing that the Homeless Alliance has done, and Lorain was part of the leadership that helped look at this, because we have big federal agencies like we've talked about, HUD, but there's others like the Department of Education and Health and Human Services. And if you look at the definition of how they say a person is experiencing homelessness, there's actually 3 very different definitions. So if you think about those big dollars flowing into our community and they're coming with that challenge right out of the gate, that becomes hard to help the people here really understand what does that mean, because the school district is counting it and working with families and students in one way. And then the Health and Human Services is actually the easiest. It literally says a person without a home. And then HUD's the most complicated, but that's where a majority of our dollars come from to address the homelessness and housing stability equation. So that's something that we've really worked hard just to educate people on. And if you navigate to our report on our website, we do share that and try to break it down and say, this is why it matters. Because we do have a lot of services in Greenville, but if you're a family with school-aged children, there's very few shelter beds that can help you and your family stay together, especially if you're a mother and a father and children. If you're a single mother with a son over the age of 10, there's one place you can go, and they can serve about 3 families at a time. So think about how hard it is, to get into that emergency shelter. So that's something that we just, and Lorain can talk about some of the solutions they've brought about once we helped kind of prime the soil and educate the community on this is why it matters. Yeah.
Can I just ask Susan a question just really quick? Is these policies you were talking about with these, this multi-pronged approach, if you will, to monies, is this battle between federal monies and state monies, is this across the country, or is this easier in some states than others?
It can be a little bit easier in some states. South Carolina is one state that doesn't take all the Medicaid dollars. So some states are able, especially in the area of housing, to put together, like Brett was referring to, some more specific strategies with those dollars for people who are really vulnerable.
Okay. Because I know we have other listeners in other places in the country and around the world. And, I just want to make it as relevant to them. Obviously, with federal, that's national, but state to state might be a little bit trickier. So thank you for clarifying that.
I would say to your listeners in other parts of the country, one agency organization that we follow and our family shelter is part of here, a network of shelters called Family Promise. And if you follow them on social media, they will explain, yes, like this is a challenge across the country because they're a network of family shelters.
Perfect.
And they often will
So much.
suggest, like, here's what we can do about it.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, and I would too say that eviction is a subject that is addressed differently in every single state across the country. South Carolina wins the award for the toughest eviction laws on the books. We probably have the highest number of evictions in the country. We have a very difficult time here negotiating for people who are, for whatever reason, 30 days past their rent, and then all of a sudden, boom, we're not talking to you anymore. You're done. There is no solution but to move you on. And that is just, in our minds, criminal. Because, again, there are things that happen that take every single resource you have away, including connection, a dying spouse or a partner, a devastating fire. I mean, there are so many things that can happen to people that leave them, without, and to have a system that supports that, supports homelessness or a situation where people are in that place is just not acceptable.
I think another issue is kind of the legal system and the definitions for what programs, like what backgrounds they can accept. So there are some programs and agencies that are much more lenient with their programs, and they will house anybody. But then there's some that if they have, petty crimes, like they were shoplifting or they were having some drugs or anything like that on them, then they've been banned from those programs and there's nowhere for them to go. And so kind of some communities that have, quote unquote, decriminalized homelessness. So it's not illegal to sleep outside in the park, or it's not illegal to sleep in your car. Those communities may have an easier time housing some people in programs versus communities where it is illegal to sleep in your car or it is illegal to sleep in the park. So now you have someone who's going to jail for a night. They now have that on their record and can be banned from countless programs for taking a nap.
Okay. Well, this was an interesting segue. Again, very good information, because who knew how complex this situation was unless you've really been in it, and you all have. So thank you. As we wrap up this first episode, because I don't know about you, Holland, I am feeling a little down right now. How about you, Holland?
It's pretty heavy stuff, isn't it?
It is. So I'm hoping that we have some positive, a little bit more of a twist in our second episode on safety when it comes to poverty and homelessness. So we're going to wrap up this first episode with a nice, neat bow. I know that's not easy to do, but what is an essential element that we can leave our listeners with to understand the stories surrounding those who are facing homelessness? Lorain, what's an essential element?
Yeah, you know what? I think the everything that I'd lead with says, just remember that homelessness is not who you are. It is where you are in the moment. Ooh. And so not defining people by the minute, but defining them by a person who is worthy and loved and needs support.
So good. What do you think, Brett?
I'll agree. The human element is important to keep in that. I mean, like I said earlier, anybody is one situation away from being in one of these situations. So remembering that it is more about a person rather than putting your perspective on decisions that they might have made or situations that they quote unquote put themselves in to be here, kind of remembering that they are a person and that they have their own story, and it could be through no fault of their own that they're here, and they shouldn't be penalized for that.
Okay. How about you, Susan?
Well, I would definitely agree with what Lorain and Brett have shared, and just say that what maybe gets me up in the morning is realizing how resilient people are in the face of this traumatic experience. And that often, I think something that people may not know is that they give back more sometimes than the support they've received. So we've seen stories and try to share those examples where, they want to pay back what was given to them because they know how hard that was, and they want someone else to receive that same level of support. And so we think that is often shocking to people who think, they're just lazy, but anyway, they're resilient, they're caring, and they're some of the most compassionate people, I think, that, walk the earth.
Thank you so much. This left us a little bit of a spark of light. So appreciate this essential element. Thank you all.
Yes, thank you, Brett and Lorain and Susan. This is a critical conversation to have, particularly in this season. While you wait for part 2, please go to theafterwordpodcast.com and become a subscriber. You can leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to tell your friends about us. And as always, remember that you are welcome at our table.